It was supposed to be a joke, a civilian toy, lost in a world of monsters. The Piper L4. Grasshopper wasn't built for war. It had no armor, no guns, not even a radio powerful enough to reach the front lines half the time. It was the kind of plane you taught your teenage son to fly on weekends, not something you sent into the skies above Normandy. And yet, somehow, this frail little aircraft, held together by fabric, plywood, and prayer, would become one of the strangest, most daring weapons of World War II. Summer, 1944. The war in Europe had reached its most violent rhythm. The Allies were pushing inland from the beaches of Normandy, facing a desperate German defense. The fields of France were burning, tanks clashed in the villages, artillery thundered through the hedgerows, and in the low gray skies, the roar of engines never stopped. High above, the war belonged to the Spitfires, the Mustangs, and the Thunderbolts. But down low, skimming just above the trees, there was another kind of war, quieter, stranger, and infinitely more dangerous. The men who fought it were not aces. They were not warriors by training. Many of them had been farmers, mailmen, or teachers before the war. They flew the Piper Cub, renamed by the Army as the L-4 Grasshopper, a slow, tiny plane used for artillery spotting and reconnaissance. Their job was simple: find the enemy, call in the coordinates, and pray they didn't get shot down while doing it. Their only defense was altitude and luck. If a German machine gunner spotted them, the Grasshopper had no chance. The only option was to dive for the ground and hope the trees hid you. But one pilot looked at his little plane and saw something different. His name was Charles Carpenter. Bazooka Charlie, they'd later call him, a schoolteacher from Illinois who joined the Army before the war. Carpenter was not the kind of man who followed the manual. He was restless, curious, and quietly rebellious. To him, the Grasshopper's weakness wasn't a curse, it was an opportunity. Its slow speed, its light frame, its ability to take off and land almost anywhere. All of that meant one thing: he could get close, dangerously close. At first, it must have sounded insane, the kind of idea you laugh off over coffee in the mess tent. What if, Carpenter joked, you just strapped a bazooka to the wing? The laughter faded when he actually did it. Using duct tape, clamps, and the Army's own M1 bazooka launchers, Carpenter mounted the weapons under each wing of his L4. He connected the triggers to cords he could pull from the cockpit. No one had ever tried it before, mostly because no one had been reckless enough to think it might work. When he took off on that first test flight, the mechanics on the ground thought he'd lost his mind. The Piper wasn't designed to carry weapons, much less fire them. The recoil alone could have torn the wing fabric apart. But Carpenter didn't care. Somewhere over the French countryside, with German armor on the move below, he leveled his tiny plane, lined up the sight, and pulled the cord. A streak of smoke, a flash, and a German tank vanished in fire. For a moment, there was silence. Then laughter. He'd done it. He'd actually hit one. Carpenter's wingman that day would later recall how the small yellow plane seemed to dance in the smoke, banking hard to avoid the anti-aircraft fire rising from below. The Germans didn't even know what they were shooting at. The idea that a liaison plane, one of those harmless observation cubs, could actually be attacking them was unthinkable. But it was real. That first kill wasn't luck. It was the birth of something new, something no manual, no command doctrine, no general could have predicted. A schoolteacher with a homemade weapon, had just turned the weakest plane in the U.S. Army into a tank hunter. And he wasn't done. Within weeks, Carpenter's Grasshopper became a legend on the front. Painted with the name Rosie the Rocketer, it flew barely above the treetops, hunting armor columns, dodging tracer fire, striking from angles too low for radar and too strange for the enemy to anticipate. Soldiers on the ground cheered when they saw it coming, a tiny yellow angel with fire under its wings. The Germans, meanwhile, started spreading rumors about a mysterious rocket plane that haunted their convoys. But behind the legend was a question that haunted even Carpenter himself. How far could you push an idea before it became suicide? And what drove a quiet, ordinary man, a schoolteacher of all people, to take a plane made for observation and turn it into a machine of destruction? That question, more than the explosions or the heroics, is what defines this story. Because the tale of the bazooka-firing Piper Cub isn't just about war or innovation. It's about the thin line between madness and brilliance, and the moment when desperation forces ordinary people to do the impossible. And for Charles Carpenter, that moment had just begun. By the summer of 1944, the war in Europe was a machine that devoured men, metal, and ideas. Every front, every unit, every commander was fighting not only the enemy, but also time itself. The Allies had landed in Normandy, but the dream of a quick breakthrough had turned into a nightmare of hedgerows, mud, and ambushes. German panzers, hidden among the thick French countryside, tore through advancing columns with surgical precision. Every hedgerow was a fortress, every crossroad a killing zone. The U.S. Army Air Forces had the skies, but air superiority meant little when targets were buried beneath the trees. Fighter bombers like the P-47 Thunderbolt and the Typhoon could deliver devastating strikes, yet they needed clear weather, open terrain, and time to coordinate with the ground troops. In the meantime, small units of American soldiers were being pinned down by armor they couldn't see, tanks that would strike and vanish behind the hedgerows. That was the world the Piper Cub pilots entered. They were part of the liaison squadrons, the quiet, forgotten branch of the Air Corps. Their mission was to fly low, spot enemy movements, direct artillery, and relay information to headquarters. Their aircraft, the L-4 Grasshopper, was a military conversion of the civilian Piper Cub, a 65-horsepower engine wrapped in canvas, light enough to push by hand. They could land in a cow pasture, take off in 50 yards, and hover over a battlefield at the height of a church steeple. But they were also defenseless. A single rifle shot could bring them down. The men who flew them were volunteers, many drawn from civilian life, often older than the average fighter pilot. They weren't adrenaline-fueled daredevils. They were thinkers, problem solvers, men who'd learned to make do with what they had. And in 1944, what they had was a war that was changing faster than any training manual could follow. By then, Germany's armored divisions were still among the most feared in the world. The Panzer IV, the Panther, and the Tiger, machines of almost mythic reputation, prowled the French countryside. Their armor shrugged off small arms fire. Their cannons could obliterate a Sherman tank before the American crew even saw them. The Allies had numbers, but not always position. And the deeper they pushed into Europe, the more the Germans used the terrain to their advantage. For U.S. infantry units, calling in artillery was the best defense against tanks. But artillery was blind without spotters. The L-4 pilots filled that role circling silently above the battlefield, radioing coordinates, watching explosions walk across the fields below as they corrected the aim shot by shot. It was precise, vital, and often suicidal work. German machine gunners quickly learned that the little grasshoppers guided the deadly rain of shells. Whenever one appeared, they opened fire. To survive, the liaison pilots flew low, very low. Some skimmed the tops of trees, weaving between smoke columns and telephone wires, hiding behind church steeples and barns. They learned to read the shadows, to disappear behind clouds, to cut their engines and glide over enemy lines in silence. Every flight was a gamble. And yet, despite the danger, these pilots were indispensable. They saw the war up close, in every shape and form. Columns of refugees, destroyed villages, tanks burning in orchards, soldiers running for cover as the earth erupted around them. They were eyes without armor, and the weight of that responsibility shaped them in strange ways. Some grew cautious, others reckless. Charles Carpenter was one of the reckless ones. Before the war, he'd been a history teacher and high school instructor in Illinois, patient, calm, methodical. But war has a way of transforming men. By 1944, he was a captain in the 4th Armored Division, attached to General Patton's 3rd Army. He'd flown countless missions as an artillery spotter, threading his fragile plane through walls of flak and tracer fire. And every time he looked down and saw German tanks rolling through the fields, he felt the same helpless rage. He could see them, he could mark them, but he couldn't stop them. That frustration was shared across the front. American ground forces were learning the hard way that traditional tactics weren't enough. Fighter bombers couldn't always arrive in time. Artillery couldn't always reach the right coordinates. Sometimes it was just a few men, a radio and a Piper Cub, staring down a steel monster with nothing but binoculars and hope. And that's when the first ideas began to emerge, half jokes, half prayers. Pilots talked about dropping grenades from the cockpit, shooting pistols at trucks, anything to fight back. The war had become personal, almost primitive. If the enemy could hide behind hedgerows, maybe it was time to bring the fight down to their level, low, close, and improvised. For most, those were just words. But for Charles Carpenter, they were a challenge. Somewhere in his teacher's mind, between the logic of geometry and the chaos of war, a thought took shape. What if a Piper Cub didn't just watch the battlefield? What if it joined it? What if this fragile, ridiculous plane could fight? That thought didn't come from madness. It came from necessity. Because in the skies over Normandy, necessity was the only thing keeping men alive. And soon, that necessity would give birth to one of the most unthinkable experiments of the war. One that would turn a harmless trainer plane into a weapon no one saw coming. By late August 1944, the Allied advance was grinding forward, but every mile was paid for in blood and broken steel. The hedgerows that had slowed them in Normandy were behind now, but ahead lay something even deadlier: the Siegfried Line, the fortress belt of Western Germany. It was here that the American army met the full fury of the Wehrmacht's armored counterattacks. Whole platoons disappeared under the guns of Panthers and Tigers, hidden in forests and villages. For the pilots of the liaison squadrons, the job had become unbearable. They flew above those battles every day, watching the destruction unfold below, helpless to do anything but report coordinates. They saw the bodies, the burning tanks, the shattered convoys, They guided artillery to targets, yes, but sometimes the shells fell too late, or too far, or not at all. They saw men die while they circled above, powerless. Captain Charles Carpenter was among them, and the helplessness was starting to eat at him. Every time he landed, his L4 spattered with mud and gunpowder residue, he carried the weight of what he'd seen. He wasn't a man built for passivity. He'd spent his civilian life teaching history, teaching about courage, invention, the human will to act. Now, in the middle of the largest war in human history, he was told to observe, not to fight. But Carpenter had something many others didn't: imagination, and a streak of quiet defiance. He knew the Piper L4 was almost weightless, barely a few hundred kilograms empty. It could take off from a meadow, float on the air like a leaf. It couldn't carry bombs. But maybe, he thought, it didn't need to. Maybe there was another weapon small enough to fit, small enough to make the impossible possible. One afternoon, in a makeshift hangar near the front lines, Carpenter began tinkering. He'd found a few discarded M1A1 bazookas, shoulder-fired anti-tank rocket launchers used by infantry. The weapons were effective at close range, capable of punching through the armor of a Panzer if aimed properly. They were light, about 6 kilograms each, and in Carpenter's mind, that meant one thing: his little plane could lift them. He began by strapping one under each wing with tape, rope, and metal clamps scavenged from the maintenance crew. It looked absurd: a pair of infantry weapons dangling from the fragile wings of a plane made of cloth. The ground crew laughed, then begged him not to fly it. "Charlie," one mechanic warned, "if the recoil doesn't tear your wings off, the Germans will." But Carpenter only smiled. He'd done the math. The recoil of a bazooka, he reasoned, was minimal compared to a mounted gun. If he could find a way to fire them remotely, it might actually work. The first test flight was pure insanity. Carpenter took off from a dirt field, the extra weight pulling the little L4 sluggishly into the air. His co-pilot on the ground watched in disbelief as he looped once, then lined up over an abandoned truck, used for target practice. From the cockpit, Carpenter reached down, pulled the makeshift firing cord he'd rigged to the bazooka's trigger, and held his breath. A white streak shot from under the wing. A second later, the truck exploded. When Carpenter landed, the mechanics stared at him as though he'd just broken the laws of physics. He grinned. "Boys," he said, "we're in business." Within days, he improved the setup. 3 bazookas on each wing, 6 in total. He wired the firing switches to the cockpit, marked their positions with chalk, and painted his plane's nose with the name Rosie the Rocketer. What had started as a field joke had become a weapon. The first time he took Rosie into combat, it wasn't a test. It was desperation. A German armored column was spotted moving near the Moselle River. Carpenter volunteered to investigate. Flying low through the valley, he saw them, 6, maybe 7 tanks crawling down the road, their turrets scanning for threats. He knew a P-47 wouldn't get there in time. So he dove. The world must have gone silent in that moment. The little L4, engine buzzing like an insect, skimming the treetops as tracer fire began to rise from below. Carpenter held steady, leveled the wings, and pulled the first trigger. The rocket streaked out, striking near the lead tank. The second shot hit true. A plume of smoke and fire erupted. He banked hard, the fabric wings creaking as bullets tore through the air around him. When he returned to base, no one believed him until infantry reports confirmed it. A German Panzer IV had been destroyed by what the witnesses described as a tiny plane firing rockets. From that day, the legend began. The newspapers back home picked up the story and gave him the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life: Bazooka Charlie. But not everyone was laughing. His commanding officers were furious. They saw it as reckless, unauthorized, a stunt that could get him killed and cost the Army an aircraft. Yet Carpenter didn't stop. He argued that his missions saved lives, that his strikes disrupted German armor when artillery couldn't respond fast enough. And in the chaos of the front, where results mattered more than regulations, few dared to stop him. The following weeks turned his name into myth. He'd dive at tanks so low that infantry swore they could see the whites of his eyes. He used terrain like a ghost, weaving between hills, popping up over trees, firing his rockets, and vanishing before the Germans could return fire. Once he destroyed a tank, a truck, and several armored vehicles in a single sortie. His little plane became a symbol, a miracle of improvisation, a story soldiers whispered about in foxholes. But there was a cost. Each mission pushed his luck further. His plane was unarmed except for its rockets. A single hit from a rifle could turn it into a fireball. He flew anyway. When asked later what he thought about the risks, Carpenter only shrugged. If you can see 'em, you can hit 'em. And if you can hit 'em, you can stop 'em. By the end of 1944, he'd claimed 6 tanks destroyed and several more damaged, a record for a man flying what was essentially a glorified kite. The press turned him into a hero. His story ran in Stars and Stripes, then in newspapers across America. To the public, he was proof that courage and ingenuity could still change the war. But among the pilots who knew him, the feeling was different. They admired him, but they also feared what he represented. Carpenter wasn't just fighting the enemy. He was fighting the limits of reason, of what a man could dare to do when everything around him was falling apart. And soon that courage would be tested in ways even he hadn't imagined. Because as the war moved toward Germany and the skies grew darker with fire and smoke, Rosie the Rocketer would face her most impossible mission yet. And the line between genius and madness would disappear entirely. Winter, 1944. The skies over Europe had turned gray, heavy with snow and smoke. The Allied advance had slowed to a crawl. The euphoria of summer victories was gone, replaced by exhaustion and mud. And then, in December, came the counterattack, the Ardennes offensive, what history would call the Battle of the Bulge. The Germans struck with fury and precision. Out of the forests of Belgium rolled more than 1,000 tanks, spearheaded by the dreaded Tiger and Panther divisions. American units were caught off guard, isolated, surrounded. Whole regiments vanished into the snow. The front, once a clear line, dissolved into chaos. For the pilots of the small Piper L4s, it was a nightmare. The weather grounded most heavy aircraft. The clouds hung low, visibility was near zero, and the cold turned engines brittle. But the liaison pilots, those flying at treetop level, could still fly. They were the only eyes left in the sky. Charles Bazooka Charlie Carpenter had by then become a legend across the 4th Armored Division. Soldiers cheered when his little Rosie the Rocketer buzzed overhead. To them, he was a symbol of defiance, the schoolteacher who'd refused to accept helplessness. But even legends get tired. Carpenter had been flying nonstop for months. His aircraft was patched with duct tape and bullet holes, its wings stained with oil and smoke. Still, when the German offensive began, he didn't hesitate. The radio chatter was chaos. Reports of armored columns breaking through, American convoys being ambushed, villages falling one after another. Carpenter fueled up Rosie, checked the bazookas strapped under the wings, and took off into the freezing mist. The air was thick with snow, the world below hidden in white fog. He flew low, navigating by instinct and memory over forests, over frozen rivers, following the distant thunder of artillery. Then, through the haze, he saw them, dark shapes crawling along a road, the faint glint of metal. Tanks, dozens of them. He had no backup, no escort, and only a few rockets left. But Carpenter was a man who measured danger differently than most. He circled once, watching the convoy move, then dove. The bazooka rockets streaked out from under the wings, slamming into the lead vehicle. The explosion blocked the road, trapping the others. He climbed, banked, came around again. German machine guns opened up, tracers slicing through the air like orange threads. One round tore through the fabric of his wing. Another shattered the side window. But he didn't pull back. He made 3 passes that day, firing every rocket he had. By the time he turned for home, 2 tanks were burning, the rest scattered into the woods. American infantry later confirmed it. Carpenter's attack had stalled a German spearhead long enough for reinforcements to regroup. When he landed, shaking and half-deaf from the blast of his own rockets, the mechanics counted 9 bullet holes in his plane. He just laughed. "She'll fly again," he said, patting Rosie's wing. That winter, Carpenter's missions bordered on suicidal. He flew alone, often against direct orders, striking wherever armor threatened to break through. His tactics became bolder, sometimes launching from fields so small his tail almost scraped the fences, sometimes gliding silently over tree lines before firing from point-blank range. He was redefining what close air support meant, turning a liaison aircraft into a scalpel of chaos. The men on the ground began to believe in the myth. They told stories of Rosie appearing out of nowhere, her rocket streaking down, German tanks bursting into flames, and then the plane vanishing back into the clouds. Soldiers said the sound of her engine, that light, buzzing hum, meant hope. "If Bazooka Charlie's still flying," one sergeant said, "then maybe we can hold the line." But there were darker days, too. Once, Carpenter returned with half his stabilizer shot away, barely keeping the plane level. Another time, a rocket misfired and exploded close enough to rattle the cockpit. He was lucky, always lucky. But everyone knew luck had an expiration date. As the Allies crossed into Germany, Carpenter's health began to falter. The endless stress, the cold, the noise, it all caught up with him. He refused to quit, but his commanders, afraid of losing their symbol, eventually grounded him for medical rest. He protested, furious. "I'm not done yet," he told them. "Rosie's still got fight left." By the time the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Captain Charles Carpenter had logged hundreds of combat hours and flown more than 70 missions under fire. His official record credited him with 6 confirmed tank kills and several vehicles destroyed. Unofficially, men said it was far more. When the fighting stopped, he walked across the airfield one last time and looked at Rosie, patched, scarred, beautiful in her own way. The little plane had survived the unthinkable. Carpenter rested his hand on the fabric skin, and for a long moment said nothing. The war had ended the way it began for him, in quiet defiance. Because in a world of giant bombers and roaring fighters, it was a single schoolteacher in a paper plane who'd reminded everyone that courage doesn't need armor. Sometimes it just needs an idea crazy enough to work. And that idea, that madness, would echo long after the guns went silent. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe, the world began to exhale. The great machines of war, the tanks, the bombers, the engines of destruction, came to rest in the mud they had once ruled. But some stories refused to fade. They didn't fit neatly into reports or medals. They lived in whispers, in half-believed tales told over campfires and reunion halls. And one of those stories was about a schoolteacher who turned a toy airplane into a tank killer. Captain Charles Bazooka Charlie Carpenter returned home that summer a hero, though he never saw himself as one. He went back to the United States, to the quiet towns and classrooms that seemed like another world entirely. The newspapers called him the one-man Air Force, the flying tank buster, the man who fought tanks with a Piper Cub. But when asked about it, Carpenter would only shrug. "I just wanted to do my part," he'd say. "I was tired of watching tanks kill our boys while I circled and did nothing." To the Army, he was a curiosity, a symbol of field ingenuity. To the men who served with him, he was something more, proof that courage wasn't reserved for the fast planes or the famous aces. It could come from anyone, anywhere, even a teacher. But the story didn't end with Carpenter. His reckless creativity had stirred something larger, a rethinking of what small aircraft could do. The military began to see the potential in light planes, not just as scouts or spotters, but as flexible, fast-response tools for close air support and counterinsurgency. The seeds sown by men like Carpenter would, years later, bloom into the concept of the armed observation aircraft, planes like the OV-10 Bronco or even the modern A-10 Thunderbolt II, both descendants, in spirit, of Rosie the Rocketer's madness. In the immediate post-war years, the Piper Cub itself became a symbol of peace. Thousands of surplus models were sold to civilians for flying lessons, crop dusting, mail routes, or just the joy of flight. People who'd never set foot in a plane before the war now took to the skies, in the same kind of aircraft that had once dodged bullets over France. The little yellow Cub became a national icon, freedom in the shape of a wing. But for those who'd served with the liaison squadrons, it carried something deeper. They knew what that fragile plane had seen and what it had done. Carpenter's later life was quieter, though his body never fully recovered from the war. He struggled with illness, exhaustion, and the invisible wounds carried by so many who had lived too long in the shadow of death. He rarely spoke of combat, but when he did, it wasn't about the kills or the glory. It was about the feeling, the absolute focus in those seconds between life and death, when the world narrowed to a single heartbeat and a streak of smoke leaving the wing. "I wasn't trying to be brave," he once said. "I just ran out of options." He died young, at 48, in 1966. No parade, no grand farewell, just quiet recognition among those who remembered. And yet, in the archives of military history, his name endured. His plane, Rosie the Rocketer, was eventually restored and displayed at the U.S. Army Aviation Museum in Fort Rucker, Alabama. The same wings that once carried him into fire now hang in peace, a relic of human stubbornness and invention. Today, when you stand before that little Piper Cub, its olive paint faded and its frame impossibly delicate, it's hard to believe it ever flew into battle. It looks too small, too simple. And that's the point. The story of Bazooka Charlie isn't about machines. It's about what happens when imagination meets desperation, when someone decides that doing nothing is no longer an option. War, at its core, is a factory of fear and conformity. It rewards obedience, punishes risk. But every once in a while, someone breaks the rules. Someone refuses to accept what can't be done. And in doing so, they remind us what human ingenuity really is. Not genius, not madness, but a refusal to surrender to the impossible. Charles Carpenter was that kind of man. A teacher who refused to sit still, a pilot who refused to observe, a soldier who refused to be afraid. His story isn't about killing tanks, it's about defying limits. And in the vast machinery of World War II, where every weapon was designed by engineers and every tactic signed by generals, it was one man's absurd, brilliant, reckless idea that proved one of the simplest truths of all: that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums like a small engine, flying just above the trees, carrying 6 bazookas and a dream.